And that's how I express myself. And so because I expressed myself this way, I, was a really angry kid. And so it made real common sense for me to support, these extremist, radical underground groups, identified as, terrorist groups, right? And even though they never harmed any living creature, since 1976, the founding of it. And so this is where I started doing writing and talking about love. And at that same time period, in my middle school, I also was a Quaker, right? Who knows what a Quaker is? And I'm not talking about oatmeal. Quakers are people that had a real strong value of prison abolition. The first support group, oddly enough, of the ALF in England, where Ronnie Lee was in prison still, and people were supporting Ronnie Lee, the founder of the ALF, wasn't a Quaker meeting or a Quaker institution, right? And they started writing letters, right, to Ronnie Lee. And I felt this resonance, like, wow, here I am. I'm a person with true pacifist values, non-violent, like, had love in my heart, and I just didn't know how to express myself, right? And so it really made sense how I got into, the environmentalism, radical, politics. So that's my activism. So it was really clear, my activism went from anti-war demonstrations to radical environmental movements to disability to queer, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it was just natural for me to make these interconnections while other people just kind of focused on one thing at a time. Does that make sense? So my scholarship, I've done a number of books now. In 11th grade, I learned how to read The Is Dog from a prison educator, oddly enough. And this prison educator, at that same year, committed suicide. And so, people thought I was going to commit suicide, and I said, no, I'm not going to give up on my life. I see these judgments. I see, I'm not saying I haven't thought about it, but I think, the world is faced with struggles. And I found out really quickly that disability studies, eco-ability, and the whole concept is all about interdependency and working together, and it's about being interwoven with each other. No one is an individual. So DIY, does anybody know what DIY is? Raise your hand if you know what DIY is. Do it yourself. So in this article, Queer Cripping Anarchism is our chapter title. It's the first one that kind of connects the three, is we're against DIY. We're for DIT. And DIT is do it together. Everything you can do it together. And so that's kind of our philosophy. And so for you normal people out there, no, there's nobody normal. But I wanted to put some order and structure to here. So kind of talk to you about what disability and normalcy is, what eco-ability is, what eco-ability challenge in the criminal justice system is, prison abolition and transformative justice. Sound good? Kind of give you an outline. People always kind of get confused where I am. So equal, social construction. I've done a lot of volunteering, started a lot of GED programs in New York. I forget I'm in New York now, because I teach in the Twin Cities, so it's really good to be back here. And so equal is a social construction. So I was in a detention center. I worked in every single detention center, volunteered in every single detention center in New York. Aided in closing down one too, which was really exciting. And I gave everybody a ruler. And it was a 6-inch ruler because they can't have a 12-inch ruler because they're going to kill somebody with a 12-inch ruler. But not a 6-inch ruler. Okay, gotcha. So I gave them all a 6-inch ruler when they had only a 2-inch piece, like a pencil. And so I said, where's equal on this measurement? I said, what do you mean? I was like, where's equal? It's a measurement. It's a methodology. Where is it? And I said, I don't know. And exactly. It's socially constructed. It doesn't exist. No one's equal. And they're like, no one's equal, then what are we fighting for, right? And I said, what you're fighting for is justice and equity, right? Not equality. And there's a major difference between equity and equality. And so, and I don't want to have sameness. No one here is the same, right? Disability is a social construction that is put onto everybody here. If your hands are too big for a pencil, you have a disability. If Shaquille O'Neal came into this door, he would hit his head. He has a disability. If somebody's too tall and they sat in this chair, they would have a disability. It's the systems and the structures around us that make us have disabilities. nothing's wrong with you all, right? Everybody has differences, but it's the systems around that you create disabilities. I did a lecture in Columbia College recently in Chicago, and somebody was in braces, right? And he was maybe 18 years old, and he said, I have disabilities. Like, see these? And he like waved them up in the air, and I really felt a passion towards him. And he says, I can't take this anymore. I have a disability, and I'm out of this room, right? But there was nothing wrong with him. And so, like other oppressed, marginalized groups, there's self-hate, self-marginalizing, and not understanding that there's nothing wrong with it. And I had that too, you know, and a lot of people in this room have had that with their own identities, right? And so it's really hard to figure out that maybe if we had a world that had sidewalks that moved, like airport sidewalks inside, then the world would, you know, would make that individual have less disabilities, right? And if there was no steps in a university, but only ramps, guess what? The people in wheelchairs would not have disabilities, right? So it's the structures that we create. And some universities, I'm sure, you know, possibly Vassar, but, you know, Vassar is pretty darn progressive. So I don't know if you all have it, but you know the old chairs, it's like the chair and the desk in one and then you pivot up, right? It creates a disability of those individuals that are left-handed or pregnant or just bigger than 5'7" and 135 pounds. Does that make sense? So it's the structures around us that create us to have disabilities. So, you know, normalcy and normal are different. Normal is the state, right? Normalcy is the philosophy behind the perpetuation of normal, right? And if people know, the first people in the Holocaust were tested on and killed to perpetuate this normalcy, right? And so we can see this normalcy that's being played out in our schools, K to 12, through rubrics. Has anybody ever heard of a rubric? Raise your hand. Okay. Grades, right? Standards tests, quizzes, reading values. Have to do 2 to 3 pages a week, 100 pages a week to read. These are constructed standards or standardization of perpetuating normalcy, right? But education in higher education is now funded by corporate, you know, entities and the academic industrial complex. So again, if we can get away from that, you know, and there's some progressive schools like here that you can create your own you know, degree and things of that sort, then we're trying to challenge it, but we're still caught up in this capitalist corporate, you know, framework that we're perpetuating normalcy and the individualism. So I wanted to kind of talk about that. Here's this, talking about a little bit about capitalism and disability. It promotes competitiveness rather than collaboration. John Dewey talked about collaboration, that no individual, no child should read a book by themselves. What a great concept, right? Consumerism, making a product that this book is perfect for certain people's eyes, but not certain other people's eyes. And if you have hands, right? And if you're able-bodied and able to flip this, right? So this book is only good for certain people. And that's what we have to understand, that there is these systems that perpetuate and that we have to challenge and dismantle. So here's eco-ability, really quick, and what it values, right? So it's like this new concept. What does it value? It values difference, which I was talking about, holistic transformation. Not oppressing one person because you did something wrong and kicking you out of the movement, but transforming and healing from it, right? And working towards that. And understanding that people have differences, right? Engaging in critical and practical understanding, and I'll talk a little bit about techno-digital justice, right? Which green anarchists, raise your hand if you know what green anarchism is. Some people? Okay. John Zerzan and others really challenge the value of any technology whatsoever, which, like, this room would not exist, right? But we understand the value of glasses. We understand the value of, you know, body modifications for trans individuals. That still, to this day, if you want to modify your body, right, you have to say that you have a gender disorder. Does anybody know that? Right? So if you still have, so we're talking about, you know, an individual, which he spoke about and then was challenged by the radical trans community in Toronto. And so none of this technology would exist, right? And a lot of us would not be able to be who, you know, where we are today, right? And our family, our grandparents, we would just assume that they just